All right, welcome back. Thank you guys for joining us. And we're going to be in chapter 15 of Matthew today. And so we invite you to read along with us. As we start in chapter 10, we're going to be going all the way to verse 20. And we're going to be talking about what defiles a person. Now, Jesus just had a run-in with the religious leaders about this. And he's not done with this yet. So let's see how he finishes this up. In verse 10 it says, "And he called the people to him and said to them, 'Hear and understand, it is not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but what comes out of the mouth, this defiles a person.' Then the disciples came and said to him, 'Do you know what the Pharisees, do you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this saying?' He answered, 'Every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted will be rooted up. Let them alone, they are blind guides, and if the blind lead the blind, both will fall into a pit.' But Peter said to him, 'Explain the parable to us.' And he said, Are you also still without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into the mouth passes into the stomach and is expelled, but what comes out of the mouth and proceeds from the heart, and this defiles a person? For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander. These are what defile a person, but to eat with unwashed hands does not defile anyone." All right, so Jesus here is actually drawing a distinction between the physical body and what you are spiritually. And there's a couple of different aspects of this that we'll want to go over as we try to unpack what Jesus is saying here and how it relates to his run-in with the religious leaders that's just occurred at the beginning of chapter 15. So recall that at the beginning of chapter 15 that Jesus was confronted by the religious leaders over not washing his hands, and this is a big deal because it shows a lack of trust and a lack of unity with God. And Jesus turned the tables on the religious leaders and showed how it was really them that were guilty of the things that they were trying to accuse Jesus and the disciples of. So Jesus goes on here to clarify because the disciples don't really get it at this point. It's funny that the religious leaders know that they know that he's opposing them, but they don't really get it quite either. And so that's why Jesus says, "Hey, do you also," to his disciples, do you also not get this? The religious leaders don't get it, but do you guys also not get it? So first of all, we need to look at a couple things. The body in the Bible can be a number of different things, just as it can be a number of different things for us. And really what the body is the body is a covenantal unity. All right, so let's think about it this way. We talk about the body politic. And what is the body politic? The body politic is the nation or the city, the state. At whatever level we're looking at, the body politic is the political union and the different aspects that make that thing a union. Now, as we look at this, it's important to understand that in modern thinking, we don't think of bodies, we think of blobs. So Jesus, when he talks about a covenantal union, he's not talking about a blob. He's talking about a body. And so what's the difference between a blob and a body? I remember as a kid watching this movie. It was an old horror movie called The Blob. And this blob kind of oozed around. And you know, if you touched it or it touched you, then you'd get kind of like sucked into the blob. The point of a blob is that a blob is homogeneous, and that homogeneous nature is important. Like if you take a blob and you cut it in half, each half is still a blob. They're completely unaffected by the fact that it's been cut in half. If you take a body and you cut it in half, it's kind of affected by that. You're in kind of big trouble if somebody cuts you in half. You don't just kind of go on as two separate pieces. You know, it's not like your legs walk around over here and your torso just kind of scoots around and everything's fine. That's not what happens. The reason for that is really important to understanding covenantal unity. Covenantal unity happens it's not a partnership or a cooperative arrangement. It's not where two things that are alike kind of come together and exist next to each other or anything like that. That's not the right understanding of a covenantal unity. A covenantal unity is actually created when two things that are not the same work for the good of the other thing. And that's an important thing to grasp. That's an important idea, a theological concept to grasp. So try to think about it this way. Your eye sees, but the eye doesn't see for itself, because that would do it no good. The eye doesn't see images for the eye's sake. The eye sees images for the body's sake. Okay, so if we were to cut off your eye, and we cut it out and we put it on the table, the fact that light is still coming into that eye is not doing the eye any good, because it can't. The eye is actually seeing on behalf of the body. The eye is sending the images, the signals that are created from the light entering into it, sending that to the brain, and the brain is processing that as images, and the brain does that on behalf of everything else in the body, right? So if the brain, let's say that you're walking across the street and you look over and you see a car coming and it's going to run you over. Well, the brain doesn't calculate and say, well, I think I'll be fine, so let's just let the car hit us. No, the brain says, hey, my body is going to have trouble from this, so let's move out of here. And it creates alarm, and it creates, and all of your body works together to get the whole thing out. Your eye might see a fire, and maybe that fire is only going to affect your hand. The brain doesn't say, well, it's only going to affect the hand. That's not a big deal to me. No, your brain says, hey, I'm going to get that hand out of the fire. Everything in your body is working on behalf of everything else. And the hand is not working on behalf of the hand. The hand is working on behalf of the body. Everything is working. All these things are different, but they're all working for everything else. Now, here's the problem. When the religious leaders confront Jesus, over and over again, the problem that he has with them is that that's not what's happening. They are not a covenantal unity, because the leaders are not working on behalf of the group. They're working for themselves. And the leaders are not related to God for his glory. They're related to God for their own glory. This is the problem that they're constantly dealing with. Now, what is it that defiles a body? It's not the eating of some kind of dirt. That's not what it is. So let's look at this again. And it says in verse 10, he called the people to him and said, hear and understand, it's not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but what comes out of the mouth. This defiles a person. Why does it defile a person? Well, if you go down to verse 18, he explains it further. He says, but what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this defiles a person. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander. These are what defile a person. But to eat with unwashed hands does not defile a person. So how do these things defile a person? Well, first of all, these things defile a person because they are destructive to the body politic, the body, the community around. So let's look at these things. Murder. If you murder somebody, is that destructive to the community? Of course, there's nothing more destructive than that, right? If you commit adultery, is that destructive to the community? Of course it is. Sexual immorality. Yes. Theft. You're stealing something from somebody else. You're thinking about yourself versus the community, of course. False witness, slander. So all these things are destructive to the people, the nation of Israel. And what's in the heart and what comes out of the person is what's destructive to the body, not what's coming in. So basically, what he's talking about is he's talking about how the religious leaders, what they have in their heart is destructive to the people, to the kingdom that they're in, and that God has given them authority in. They're being destructive to that kingdom, but also it's destructive to the body. Of the theological body, the fact that God is in a covenant unity with us. And when we do these things, we're actually attacking God. Our hearts are against God. And all of these things are both destructive to the community around us, but also to the covenantal unity that we have with God and that we experience with God. And so the problem here is that it's not about what you eat. Now, the interesting thing here is that if you look at this, our culture has become more and more and more obsessed with what they eat, which is a very interesting situation. So when I was a kid, nobody had food allergies or food issues that you had to worry about. I remember all the time you'd go over to your friend's house and they'd slap something together and you'd eat it, and you didn't, it didn't matter if there was nuts in it, it didn't matter if there was gluten in it, it didn't matter if it was vegan, it didn't matter if it was pescatarian, it didn't matter, none of these things, vegetarian, none of these things were things back then, really. Now, I'm not saying they existed nowhere, but they were such minuscule things that none of the regular people that you kind of dealt with every day, none of them were having these issues. Now, I'm not saying that nobody had an allergy to any kind of food ever, but they were such small things. Like you never saw a warning of like you can't bring your peanut butter sandwiches to school. That's all we brought to school. Like every day was a peanut butter sandwich. Now, the interesting thing is that as our culture has moved farther and farther away from God, they've moved closer and closer to these very stringent food issues. Now, there's a reason for that. Now, obviously, if you're allergic to peanuts or shellfish or meat or whatever, and you can't eat it, that's not what I'm talking about here. But what I'm talking about here is that there's a lot of people who are very strict about their diet. They only eat meat, they only eat fish, they only eat vegetables. There's a lot of strictness there. Now, the question is, why is it that our culture is moving farther and farther to that? I was watching a show recently on TV, and it was a show with some chefs, and several of the chefs were vegan or whatever. And one of the things that was interesting is that all these chefs that had these very strict dietary things, which is interesting for a chef, they all happened after periods of trauma in their life, or periods of betrayal in their life, or when things were really going wrong or difficult. Now, the interesting thing is, why is it that our culture is going toward these food issues at the same time it's moving away from caring really about what God wants or God says or God commands? Well, because you either have one or the other. You see, people are born with an innate desire to be holy and to have some kind of purity and control over who they are. We're hardwired to make distinctions about what we should be and shouldn't be. And the interesting thing is, you either do that spiritually or you do that physically. And what Jesus here is saying is that the spiritual aspect of this is what's really important. It's not the physical aspect. And in fact, what happens in the book of Acts is that when the church is instituted, there's the sheet that comes out of the sky with all the different kinds of food on it, and Peter's told that he needs to kill and eat, and 3 times it says that. The issue is that the food issues are not the thing, it's the spiritual issues that are the thing, and that's what we have to worry about. Now, that's a lot more restrictive. It's funny because I think of like what it would cause me to be a vegetarian or anything, to be any kind of an Aryan. It sounded wrong. A vegetarian or a pescatarian or a meatitarian, whatever it is. If you're going to exclude a lot of food, that's going to that's going to require some sacrifice, and that's going to be difficult. And I look at that and I think it's just not worth it to me. Now, it's a lot harder, though, to do the spiritual things. It's actually a lot more costly to do the spiritual things. You're going to give up false witness. You're going to give up lying. You're going to give up slandering. I mean, how difficult is that for us? You're going to give up theft, and there's a lot of things that can fall under theft. Sexual immorality, there's a lot of things that can fall under that. Adultery, murder. Murder, remember, Jesus talks about being angry with your brother that's the inner, or the spiritual part of murder. So you're going to have to actually do a lot. It's a lot harder to get the spiritual aspect right than it is the physical aspect right. But what happens is we need to do something, and so having faced something that's difficult and not having the desire to do it because we don't really trust in that God is calling us to this because it's in our good, we go to the physical side of it. So I think that's very clearly what's happening in our culture. So what's defiling a person? It's not what you put into your mouth. It's not what you put into yourself. It's what comes out of you. Well, thanks for joining us this week. We appreciate it. We'll see you next week.